welcome everybody to the first of 5 events as part of this Sloane Lab Seminar Series on reconnecting heritage collections as data, infrastructure and participatory engagement, big dreams and big challenges. As I said, this is the first of 5 events that welcome a range of speakers who are interested in the intersections between collections as data, cataloguing histories and critical archival studies, heritage infrastructures, critical digital heritage and information science. And this series is co-hosted by University College London, TU Darmstadt, British Museum, the Natural History Museum, University of Southampton and the University of Portsmouth, and convened by a number of individuals from those institutions, including myself, James Baker, who will be one of the chairs for this session. And I should finally say thanks to our funders for this Sloane Lab session, the Towards a National Collection funded by UK Research and Innovation. So today we have a museum themed session together and 2 wonderful speakers. First we have Kathleen Lawther, who is a freelance curator and collections researcher, who notably, I think between March and September 2022, was a Headley Fellow at the Palcott Museum, worked on a project around museum makers, people-centered cataloguing, and there they trialed a people-centered approach to researching, documenting and digitizing collections of photographs at the museum. More recently, last September, they began their PhD research as a Future 100 scholar at University of Leicester at the Institute of Digital Culture, looking at how the history and practice of documentation in museums has impacted what is available as digital collections. And today they'll be speaking on the subject, people make the data, museum makers, people-centered cataloguing and collections as data, and no doubt drawing on their award-winning guide around people-centered cataloguing. We also have a second speaker who will be joining us shortly. Florence Okoye is a qualitative researcher, user experience and service designer at the Natural History Museum, and they'll be speaking today on approaches for anti-colonial narratives through digital collections, no doubt touching on their work around creative user experience design. Each of our speakers will speak for approximately 25 minutes, which should leave us at the end around 25 minutes or 20 or so minutes given this introduction for questions, and we'll be aiming to close at 2 p.m. UK time. Before we get going, just a few notes in relation to the code of conduct for this session. So the purpose of this symposium is to offer a space to think and explore together, and as a result, speakers and attendees both contribute to making the space and the symposium a success. We value and encourage all points of view expressed to build a constructive dialogue, and in this spirit we ask that questions should be asked through the Zoom Q&A function, which can be accessed via the bottom of the screen. You should be able to see a little button that says Q&A, and that those questions are asked with respect and generosity in a way that promotes dialogue rather than shuts it down. In the highly unusual circumstance that questions are asked in a way that we feel is disrespectful, offensive, aggressive or otherwise unacceptable, we will, as a team of conveners, take the appropriate steps, which may include asking the questioner to leave the session. But of course, we are hopeful this will not be required. So those of you who's joined us attendees today, and thank you so much for joining us. If you can't find Q&A, please do ask one of the team in the chat. Presume you can access that. If not, have a little Google and find where Zoom says the Q&A button should be. But with those introductions done, I shall hand over to Kathleen to share their slides and talk us through people make the data.
Thanks, James. I'll just share my slides now. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be actually the first speaker in this series. And the series has come at a time when I, as James mentioned, have kind of moved between the worlds of museum collections and academic research. I've been working in museums for 13 years, mostly in collections management and documentation. And I started my PhD last autumn. So today I'm mostly going to be talking about the last major museum project which I did, and how this and my other experiences in museums have informed my research. So from March to September 2022, I was Headley Fellow at the Palcott Museum, working on the project People-Centered Cataloguing. And then from September, I began my PhD research, which looks at the history and practice of documentation in museums and how this has impacted what is now available as digital collections, or what might also be called the digital cultural record, or collections as data. So where these projects overlap and where my headspace has been for the last year or so is here. The processes by which a physical collection is recorded as data and the people involved in these processes. So I chose the title People Make the Data because I wanted to emphasize that collections data is created, descriptions are written, and choices are made by people. There is no digitization of an object to create data without people translating the physical form and cultural significance of the object into words and recording them as text that a machine can read. So although I'm talking about the idea of people-centered cataloguing and giving examples of my work at the Powell Cotton Museum, I'll be talking about centering people in our cataloguing practice, but so that you can understand the context of the work, I'm going to start where museums usually start, which is with the objects. Sorry, bear with me here. Having trouble moving my slides along. Okay. So the focus of my project was a collection of over 700 photographs taken in southern Somalia in the 1930s by Diana Powell Cotton. She was the daughter of the founder of the Powell Cotton Museum. And before I started working on them, only a few of them had been digitized, but the museum had found that people were very interested in those that had been shared. And I worked with the museum team to develop a project which would allow the museum to digitize and catalogue the photographs while giving me the opportunity as a researcher to test out some ideas about how to better record information about people connected to the collections and how to center the needs of users. So I was able to apply for a Headley Fellowship with the Art Fund to spend dedicated time researching these collections. And I'm going to draw on examples from this project and also provide some suggestions and case studies of how other museums might approach people-centered cataloguing. So I wanted to introduce myself in more detail as well. And there was a version of this slide with a photo of me, but it was a bit too cringe. So you've just got this anonymous cataloguer. And thinking about the positionality of cataloguers. Positionality statements which explain a researcher's background and approach to research are more common in academic research, but not in museums and cataloguing, because it has been assumed that cataloguing is a neutral activity not affected by personal bias. So I want to explain something about my positionality. I'm a white British woman, I'm straight, cisgender, non-disabled, and from a working class background. As I said, I've worked in museums for 13 years, mostly in collections management. And I think that that's important because it means that I'm more likely to look at the systems within the museum rather than focusing on details. And I consider myself a generalist, meaning that I've worked with a lot of different types of collections and I don't have a subject specialism. So although I know a lot about museum practice and collections, before this project, I did not know much about Somali history or culture, and yet I was able to get funding to work on this project. So I just wanted to reflect on the fact that I am in a privileged position to be able to secure that funding. And some of that has to do with the fact that my identity and presentation is quite typical of the UK museum workforce and funding organisations. And I've not faced any of the barriers that someone who is actually from a Somali heritage background might have faced in working with these collections. So I also want to acknowledge the work of many other people and projects which my work was able to build on and add to, including individuals and organisations who have shown an interest in these collections, and other projects at the Powell Cotton Museum which they have been involved in while trying to reimagine their approach to their collections. So the idea of people-centered cataloguing came from combining elements of people-centered design with good cataloguing practice. People-centered design is a practice where designers focus on specific people's needs, taking time to learn from particular populations, while the Spectrum Standard for Collections Documentation defines cataloguing as the ongoing process for recording and managing information about collections, often from multiple perspectives, to meet the needs of a range of users. And it's worth noting that this definition of cataloguing was updated in 2022 as part of the Collections Trust's Rethinking Cataloguing campaign. They rewrote this part of the Spectrum Standard in response to questions around decolonial practice, how to deal with problematic legacy cataloguing information, and how to record more diverse perspectives on collections. So the new procedure shifts the focus of cataloguing from the needs of only the museum to the needs of a variety of users. And as James kindly mentioned, this project actually won the Collections Trust Award recently, recognising the museum's efforts to rethink their cataloguing. So while speaking about this previously, I've said that traditionally cataloguing practice in museums has centred the needs of the institution, prioritising supposedly objective descriptions. But I would add that this systematic and institutional approach to collections information is itself relatively recent, developing in the late 20th century, along with computerized collections management systems and standardization across the sector. And prior to this, cataloguing practice would have centered the needs of the individual curator. And this is something I'll return to. So both curator-focused or institution-focused cataloguing have resulted in a body of records that privilege certain individuals and cultures and contain offensive assumptions and generalizations about others. And they can fail to capture what makes objects meaningful for people. So to counter this, we focus our attention on the following groups: users and potential users, the people behind the collections, and the people behind the records, including ourselves. And I'm going to describe how I approached each one within this project. Starting with users and potential users of collections information, the full records of our museum collections are often only accessible to internal staff, and museums may make some or all of their records available digitally, but this is usually the catalogue entry, which has been written with internal users in mind, simply republished online. Users access digital collections for different reasons, but their information needs are not always catered for in the way that museums present their collections. So rather than assuming that online collections information can and will be accessed by everyone, a people-centered design approach to collections information focuses on the needs of a specific group or groups. The Pal Cotton Museum already knew that they had a significant collection of material from Somalia. It's one of the largest collections of Somali material in Europe. And they knew from previous work with Somali audiences and collaborators that many people were more interested in the photographs that Diana took than the objects she collected. But the museum was also aware that there was no such thing as one homogenous Somali community that they could reach out to. So in this project, I focused on the needs of three specific groups: direct descendants of some of the people in the photographs, who are people from the Bajuni Islands off the coast of Somalia, Somali diaspora communities in East London. This is because the museum is located in Birchington, a village in Kent, which is a predominantly white area. And the nearest city with a significant Somali population is in London. And then finally, a broader category of Somali and Somali diaspora communities online. So for the first group, the museum was already in contact with members of the Bajuni diaspora community living in Kenya, who had recognized family members in the photographs from the Bajuni Islands. The contemporary afterlife of this collection started when some of the photographs were used in a display at the British Museum. And this meant that some of them were digitized and shared online on the British Museum's Object Journeys website. From there, they began circulating on WhatsApp and social media, and this led to Faiz Mohammed Shi making a comment on the BM website and saying that he'd recognized people in the photographs. So such a direct connection was a really rare opportunity for the museum, both to share more of the photographs with Faiz and his family and their networks, and then with their permission to record more information about the individuals in the photographs. And this also led to a co-curated display at the Barbican Library in London, working with producer Abira Hussain. The cataloguing work centered the needs of the Bajuni community, but the interpretive story around reconnecting with ancestors has a universal appeal. So to better understand the second audience, I used some of my fellowship budget to organize a user research workshop, and I was able to work again with Abira and Sophia Jama of Women's Inclusive Team based in Tower Hamlets to hold a workshop where an intergenerational group of Somali women came to see and discuss the photographs. I created surrogate copies of the albums and shared the images on screen with them. And we talked about what interested them about the photographs and what the future interpretation of the photographs might look like. So unlike the Bajuni community, these women didn't have a direct connection to any of the people or places in these images. But there are common aspects to some of the visual culture, and that is what interested people. Because Diana Pal Cotton was a budding anthropologist when she collected these, she was interested in the daily lives of people and collected things like cooking implements, crafts, and things to do with adornment and dress and medicine. So some of these themes are already there in the interpretation that the museum has of these collections, but they're based on Diana's interests. And so this session confirmed that these collections are relevant to some Somali audiences today, but that the lens could be shifted and the way that those themes are explored could be more tailored to their interests. So for the last group, which is also the broadest, I wanted to engage people online using social media, since we knew that these images were already being shared on various platforms. I created an Instagram account to share the photos, which you can access using the QR code on screen. By the end of my work on the project, there were about 200 followers, which is not a huge amount. But looking at who those followers were, I could see that they were Somali names, Somali flags in their bios, and that it was young people. And so even though it was not thousands of followers, I was really happy that the people I was engaging were the people that I was trying to reach. And I was able to use some of the features of having a professional Instagram account, like doing polls, looking at what was the most popular content and asking questions about the kind of things that interested people around the collections. Obviously, it's not a huge sample size, but it was a really useful tool to start to get some insights from different people. When I set the Instagram up, I was hoping to get more engagement in terms of public comments on the page, which didn't really happen. But what I did get was quite a few DMs sent to the account, which were had some really positive and touching feedback about how people were experiencing seeing the photos. So all of these interactions with users of the collections helped to influence the way I was writing the catalogue records, which was recording information that was important to people. But it also reminded me that it is the people who have a cultural connection to these photographs who can create the most meaningful interpretations. So I saw my role in cataloguing as making this material accessible for them, as opposed to me attempting to dictate the meaning of the collections. So the next group of people I want to talk about are the people who created the collections. Museums have historically recorded the contributions of only a very few individuals, those with the influence, wealth, and privilege to collect, donate, and ensure their names were remembered. Yet there were usually many other individuals who contributed to the historic collections. And this has included people like the original makers or owners of objects, people who facilitated collection by translating, navigating, or locating specimens, and the people who prepared and documented collections so that you could collection. The Palcott Museum makes an excellent case study for this. The museum was founded as a single-room collection by Percy Palcott in 1896 and was run by the Palcott family until 2006. The stories that the museum originally told glorified the family and didn't support the history of their collections. Now the museum is run by an independent trust, and they're working on a program of reimagining the museum inspired by the vision statement, People Matter. As part of this work, the museum has been researching and sharing the stories of more of what they've called museum makers, the people who contributed to the Palcott Museum and its collections. And they've been able to do this because the Palcottons were more diligent than most collectors in recording names. However, they would sometimes just record the first name of a person who was working for them, and this was often an anglicized nickname rather than what the person may have called themselves or preferred to be called. So in order to work with this messy and partial data, we took the approach that rather than aiming for a standardized form of all names, separated into title, first name, surname, we would record the name in one field without splitting it into parts. And we also recorded alternative versions of names elsewhere in the record so that people could be found by searching different versions of their name. So for some people, the museum could only record what the Palcottons had previously recorded, but for others, like the Bajuni Islanders, it was possible to recover their names through working with descendants. This is an example of the way that standardized cataloging, which is useful when thinking about collections as data, can flatten information and force you to try and apply things like Western naming conventions to where they simply do not apply. And in this case, we felt that recording something, however messy, was better than recording nothing. So the Palcottons were unusual in that they recorded people's names at all. Because of the way in which most collections and collections information have been gathered over time, many individual people's names have not been recorded. And this is especially true for people who have historically been marginalized and others. In ethnographic collections, where items have been selected as typical of a culture or group, it's usually only the group name which has been recorded. And these cultural group names, which have been attributed to museum objects, are often outdated exonyms, and some of which are offensive to people who are descended from those communities and are not the words that they would use themselves. And even when terms are not offensive, an old anglicized spelling of a term may make it undiscoverable to someone searching a contemporary term. So obviously the best way to find out the most appropriate term to use would be to conduct more user research with interested people with links to cultural groups in order to identify terms that are accurate, respectful, and useful for them in connecting with their heritage. But this requires dedicated time and resources in addition to staff time. Museums should be prepared to offer payment to or negotiate mutually beneficial exchanges with any potential users they reach out to. And the museum also needs to have a fairly good idea of who descendant communities are in advance of reaching out, and to have done some initial work to identify collections which might be of interest to them. And so that was the case with this project, because contact with Faith, who had a link with the photographs, had come long before the project conception and funding. Rather than coming up with an idea that met the needs of the museum and then looking for people to work with, we used the funding opportunity to create more capacity to work with people who the museum were already in contact with. So the final group that I want to talk about are the people behind the records. Most museum databases and paper records contain information by many people, compiled by many people over many decades. And yet the person who writes the description of the object is rarely acknowledged. There's an assumption that a description is neutral and objective. Again, the Powell-Cotton Museum is something of an outlier, since almost all of the collections were collected by the family, and they had their own systems for recording notes and information about the collections. And all of this was to serve their own interests and needs and tell the stories that they wanted to tell. They also had paid staff who they could direct to complete additional cataloguing to their liking. So the photographs which this project focuses on were taken by Diana Powell-Cotton. She recorded information about the people and places depicted in them in her diaries and notebooks while she was traveling, and this in turn formed the basis of the museum's records. So how can thinking about Diana as an individual help the museum identify gaps and omissions in the collection's records? So Diana had no formal training as an anthropologist, and these photographs were taken on her first visit to the African continent. So she didn't have any knowledge about Somali culture before she arrived in the country. She traveled with her father and would have been influenced by his collecting practices. And she also had contact with other Europeans in the area, including the Italian colonial government and Swedish missionaries. And this gave her privileged access to some spaces. For example, several of the photographs show a tour which she and her father were given of wells which had been built in an area by the Somali government. So in a way, we can see this as her being shown colonial propaganda to demonstrate how the Italians thought that they were benefiting people in the area. She also visited the National Museum of Somalia in Mogadishu, which was also run by the Italian colonial authorities, and made notes about Somali people and culture based on the content there. So while the family were not directly involved in colonial administration themselves, it's obvious how Italian perspectives on Somalia would have informed her impressions of the country and people. She worked with translators and fixers, including Hassan Ali, who were Somali men. And their position may have affected the accuracy of the information they were able to give her, particularly around women and people from non-Somali ethnic minorities, such as the Bajuni people. And she then sent her notes and diaries back to England, where they were typed up by Beryl Fuller, who was a private secretary for the Powell-Cottons. The repeated copying of information and the fact that Miss Fuller would not have had any familiarity with the information she was typing up increases the possibility of error in these records. So all of this context reminds us that the information that Diana recorded is not neutral. What she wrote and the way it was recorded was shaped by her experiences and influenced by many other people. The gaps identified by this work have helped the museum to seek new perspectives. For example, Diana's male interpreters may not have been able to give her accurate information about women and non-Somali minorities, but by speaking with diaspora women and Bajuni people today, we have attempted to address some of these gaps. So I just wanted to return to the point about legacy catalogue information not being standardized or intended to fit into complex systems, because, as I said, these records were entirely created by Diana for her own needs. And to make sense of legacy catalogue information, it's useful to think about when it was written and in what context. And it's also useful to know who wrote it, whether it was the collector, a specialist curator, a collections manager, or a volunteer, because each of these individuals will have brought different levels of skill, knowledge, and lived experience to their work. Approaches to cataloguing can vary depending on people's roles in organizations, their training, and the discipline they work in. Our cataloguing work is also influenced by personal factors, interest, bias, and positionality. So by acknowledging that past cataloguers have brought their own experiences and ideologies to the records they wrote, we can examine the gaps and omissions and start rebalancing the record to include information and perspectives that have been excluded. Collections Trust advises that museums should have a documentation procedural manual to include a section on the history of your documentation systems. And this document can also be used to record information about the people who have been responsible for cataloguing in your institution in the past, or refer to where that information can be found in your collections management system. This information can sometimes be recovered by looking at institutional archives, staff records, and meeting minutes. So one of the things that we can do today is to record information about ourselves. One of the consequences of viewing documentation work as objective and neutral is that we have not considered this necessary. A simple way to address bias in contemporary records is to record who has written a description or interpretive text. A named author can then be linked to a person record in your collections management system. And any information we record about ourselves will help future guardians of collections that we work with to understand our work and why we've made the decisions we've made. So coming to the end, I just want to reflect on this project and the differences between this kind of work and the kind of work that things like Towards the National Collection are working on. This project has been all about working very closely with a small collection, which is less than 0.25% of the museum's photographic holdings, not taking into account all of their objects and archival holdings. It's been about focusing on a particular community and framing digitization and cataloguing work around them. It has been about narrowly focusing effort to record data centered about this one collection, taking into account the specificity of where information has come from and whose voice it represents. And in a lot of ways, this is the opposite of a large collections data projects like Towards the National Collection, which are concerned with linking existing data from millions of objects across institutions and taking a God's eye view of the mass of collections information. And I perhaps haven't demonstrated that very well here, but what this slide is meant to show is the kind of the value of zooming in, that you can have, these hundreds among thousands of photographs, but when you zoom in and find that it's that can be identified as an image of someone's great-grandmother, that is when the collections have real value. So is there a way for these larger scale projects to pay attention to origins of collections documentation in the way that the People-Centered Cataloguing Project has, and to analyse patterns of who has contributed to records and biases in the digital cultural record at scale? Unfortunately, I believe that the reality is that contextual information, the paradata that reveals who wrote a description, when and why, is absent from the vast majority of our records, along with so much else that is missing. This data is missing, but it's not irretrievable. It needs resources and people with diverse skill sets and expertise to work on improving our documentation. But until museums, funders, and research councils are willing to put money into documentation work, projects working only with existing collections records are not going to be seeing the full picture. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and for keeping almost perfectly to time. I really appreciate that. Florence has now joined us. I did briefly introduce you earlier, Florence, so maybe while I introduce you again to the audience, you could put any slides up that you have, if you have any slides, and just check you can do that. Okay, so just to remind everyone, so Florence is a qualitative researcher, user experience and service designer at the Natural History Museum, and we'll be speaking on approaches to anti-colonial narratives through digital collections. We have, as with Kathleen, we have about 25 minutes for this paper, and then we will take some questions at the end. I know that one or two of you have been putting a few queries into the Q&A as we've been going along. I would encourage you, if you have questions that are starting to emerge, to put them in the Q&A now rather than later, and I believe at the end Daniele will choose the ones that we think are interesting questions, or indeed are up-voted questions in the Q&A to bring to our panel. So when you're ready, Florence, I'm happy for you to go, though I can't see your shared screen if you have shared it.
That's okay. Yeah, don't worry. I'll share it when I come to that point. But yes, so hello, everyone. It's really great to be a part of this symposium. And yeah, what I hope to sort of like get a little bit into are some different sort of like, I suppose more creative, some of the creative approaches that have been experimenting with as ways of kind of like of bringing about anti-colonial narratives within, well, I say digital collections, but it could be collections as a whole. So I thought it might be helpful just to also start off with a little bit about, I suppose, some terminology. You know, I tend to use the term anti-colonial, especially when it comes to institutions, especially national museum and sort of gallery institutions. I think mostly because I think it's important to remember that coloniality is very much rooted in material conditions, right? So in political relations. And as such, there are certain institutions within which to talk about decolonization, although that may be kind of fashionable, sort of doesn't really make sense, whether from a material or a political perspective. They are in many ways impossibilities. However, I do think that given the conditions that we find ourselves in, there are certainly kind of like alternative ways of doing which can account for, and maybe to some extent make up, I guess, for certain traces or lineages of or practices of coloniality. That might include things like the inaccessibility of, say, collections for key publics. Now, some of this obviously may well be due to kind of long-standing perceptions about what museum institutions and similar actually provide. It's, in fact, just yesterday I was having a conversation with someone who is very much engaged with the arts, but actually it wasn't until like their son was doing GCSE in art realized that actually you can, for example, make a request of certain like galleries to kind of, you know, simply sort of take out objects, obviously, to so long as it's, you know, safe enough to do so, and for, say, a visiting artist or researcher to look into, so to look at and learn and directly learn from. Again, there's nothing particularly new about this challenge. I think this is one of those problematics that probably many of us here are fully aware of. And indeed, I think, you know, there's a lot of work that is being done by various organizations and institutions to enable that intentional and consistent engagement across all the different touch points that might be relevant for these often underserved publics, as it were. So whether that's connecting to school curricula, you know, and ensuring excellent SEO so that you turn up in a student's web search, or doing outreach among specific layers of these underserved communities. So whether workshops, conferences, hackathons, community events and whatnot. So that's kind of one, I suppose, trace or type of coloniality that I think it's quite interesting to try to address in different ways. And then there's other forms, again, kind of equally sort of well known and well understood regarding the accessibility of collections themselves. So yes, even you know, there's obviously the challenges in making sure that collections are accessible, whether digitally or otherwise, and certainly if they are available online, yes, again, those problematics about, well, are they accessible platforms? Are the platforms able to be updated? Are the APIs able to be updated and publicly consumed? All of those are kind of like other problematics that I think what I might term as anti-colonial practices can be useful for mitigating. And I think it's also really, again, just to kind of give some context for the approach that I will be getting into a bit later, you know, I think it's always good to kind of remind ourselves that, you know, much of the knowledge that is stored within our collections is not, you know, simply interesting, although it is. It's not solely of, you know, of academic interest, but actually has the capacity for communities to engage with in order to better understand themselves, the world around them, and to take ownership of the various environments, whether that's social, political, or natural around them, and to make the decisions that, you know, that they need to thrive. And so when I talk about anti-colonial practices in the context of this kind of well-established and known problematics and the potential for the collection, I'm particularly thinking about ways that we can counter, for example, habits of centralization, what things that we can do to counter the inequity. So obviously I am working in the context of a scientific research institution, and my specific interest in my research interest is very much on science communication and science capital. So there are certainly things I think that an anti-colonial practice can potentially contribute to tackling that inequity at the heart of what we might call science capital. And yes, I say that in mind, bearing in mind all the problematics with that term, as well as, say, the inaccessibility of the actual knowledge within the collection. So not simply the inaccessibility of the collections themselves, but like the resultant, the emergent knowledge, the tools to analyze and develop new forms of knowledge from those collections. And finally, I think one particular sort of coloniality that is very key to counter is what I'm, just for the sake of this talk, kind of referring to a sort of obfuscation. It's an obfuscation of our processes, our networks, our connections, all the things that are actually quite integral to what might be outputs or what might be platforms that museums, libraries, archives, galleries might have. And that's the one that I kind of want to focus on. Because as I was saying, one of the things that often comes out from the places that my role as a user experience designer and a user researcher and a systems thinker takes me to is very much that in order to make the kind of data within our collections relevant to people, at some point, conversations will turn towards how the collection originated, what it was used for, what it currently is being used for. I've certainly given previous lectures and talks about how what I find really interesting is that for all the institutional, and I mean this more broadly, so not specifically thinking about the Natural History Museum in the least, but for all that sort of institutional or sector-wide sort of discomfort about certain histories and connections, the reality is actually that that discomfort is very much needed. That friction is actually what's needed in order to make the collection and the knowledge within relevant for some of these underserved publics. I think it shows in some ways that there's almost a bit of, one might say, growing up that has to be done, right? That one cannot have it both ways in order to show oneself as relevant, to some of these underserved, often marginalized publics, in order to enable communities to engage with one. You know, you have to figure out why it is that you, as you know, an organization may have disengaged from them in the first place. All of that requires encountering and dealing with the discomfort rather than avoiding it. And I think it's particularly worth highlighting because one of the things I from a personal perspective, I sometimes do get a bit concerned about is how much of this discussion, whether it's about decolonization or anti-colonization or whatever, you know, it can sometimes be communicated as almost something, you know, done by a bunch of like vainglorious do-gooders. And actually there's also a reality wherein it's actually something that's needed not solely for you know, for like virtue signaling or whatever others might term it, but actually it's something that is actually required in order for institutions like museums to be able to showcase their relevance to wider publics, to wider communities. Anyway, so like I said, you know, I gave a list of sort of the various different forms of colonialities to tackle, and of course there are many others. And I'm particularly interested in the way that whether it's the development of what might be called expertise or the siloing of knowledge systems, how that has arisen from a kind, as I said, a kind of obfuscation of where collections, knowledge, data has originated from. So whilst my day job at the Natural History Museum is very much focused on creating services and you know, understanding complex systems and you know, trying to create usable, accessible, ethical products for visitors and other audiences who engage with us alike. I think more broadly, I'm particularly interested in questions of how organizations and groups of people actually really work, not sort of like how we think we work or how we would like to work, but actually what are the points of handovers and connection points, or indeed the lack thereof. One of the projects I've been exploring on and off is how we can give insight into the gaps and contradictions within our teams and organizations, which has kind of resulted in a sort of holistic design algorithm, a process wherein one can combine narrative and matrices and all that good stuff into sort of visual, wherein values for particular actors can be more easily identified by people working within the system. And then they can kind of see the contradictions that arise between, say, how different departments or indeed individuals are trying to imbibe or live up to, or indeed simply ignore particular overarching values. I mentioned that just because narrative is a big part of the process, and that sort of fits into the overall thesis of this of the talk, which is about kind of using more creative approaches for uncovering and revealing ways that processes work, and how fundamental that is as part of any anti-colonial practice. I thought it's also worth mentioning the fact that you know, it's not just people like myself who are interested in these sort of approaches. I'm just going to put a link in the chat to the work of Matteo, actually a good friend of mine who's a game designer, and he did a lot of work whilst he was a resident at the V&A using game design as a way of kind of revealing the way that the museum works to the people within the museum. So when we're talking about kind of like more creative approaches, one of the things that I tend to do, I'm not a game designer, alas, I'm much more sort of like an interdisciplinary researcher and sort of service designer. One of the things I've often done is things like facilitating design jams, which are structured to include opportunities for participants to sort of digest and discuss their ways of working, their experience of the space within which they are active, but also equally importantly, sort of like going back to the general public. It's a way of always making sure one is engaged with publics who perhaps may not usually in the grand scheme of things be engaged until, say, the very end of a project or whatever. So this is the sort of thing that's been done, say, with curators, with learning teams, all at once. I think that's the other thing. So really trying to break down silos within the organization. Other experiments have included creative practice to help reveal the fuzzy logics, those dynamic associations that people make between topics and themes in ways that things like survey data and even in-depth interviews can't quite do. So one of the things that I tend to use a lot is like the zine making, not least because it's fun and to some extent disarming, but it's also a site of learning through conversation, which can then be communicated through a material object. And so, yeah, for the past couple of months, for example, I've been hosting sort of like zine making workshops as a regular part of Lates at the museum, and also to accompany activities such as some tours around colonial histories of collection and queer natural history. And the way these work is by providing critical provocations based on the theme, which people can respond to by making a zine. And the responses might range from visual to story-based. Some are more literally about the topic, others around emotional social experiences that are brought to the surface by the theme and by the provocations. If the sessions allow more conversation, what often arises is a critical engagement with the topic itself. So, for example, discussions about sex differences and sexual behaviors in the so-called natural world can lead to participants realizing that what might seem as norms within human cultures are actually a process of social cultural prescriptivities, right? There's a power dynamic and an active, that it's an active act, as it were. It's not something that kind of that's supposed natural, in quotes. And what's relatedly, these provocations in practice also raise questions of knowing, like how did we know in the past? How do we know now? What might we know in the future? And this again is a good example of the importance of accepting that friction is a necessary, or tension or discomfort is a necessary part of the museum industrial complex, as we might call it, becoming truly relevant and engaging with the communities. One cannot have these conversations without actually, in some ways, almost having more critical conversations about the role of our research institutions, or the role of our collections, or indeed the very way that science is done. All of these conversations kind of implicitly lead on to wider discussions about knowledge generation and epistemic structures, and the very foundation of our taxonomies. When considering the creative outputs from a solution design perspective, there are a variety of frames for analyzing them, which I've used. So they can be considered as metadata about a particular topic or area of the museum's collections. If I look at the zines created through the perspective of a product requirements document, one can almost immediately see the problematics for existing systems to address the needs of the particular audience, or the one kind of making the zine. Which clearly, from the kinds of questions asked, in practice would require at the very least a system or solution architecture which is capable of evolving and connecting to others, if not indeed creating entirely new translation interfaces that can match often the emergent metadata that one can get from the zine, as it were, from the creative output. Amongst other things, in closing, glamour is a powerful tool for obfuscation. And in the cases of institutions which are focused on engaging audiences with a deeper understanding, an unintended outcome often of the physical layout, very nature of the museum is just that, is kind of this sense of awe and wonder, and at particular ages, nostalgia, which all kind of act as a form of glamour that can obfuscate the underlying knowledge generation, power structures and dynamics that basically from which the direct experience kind of emerge. What I found is that the mundanity of a craft-based approach, the way that the setting of this sort of activity allows a conversation and connection to enable people to speculate in ways that go beyond the charisma of dinosaurs and elephants and rhinos with plastic horns. What a creative method can provide us as system designers, as service designers, as solution architects, are thus other means of peering into the ways that people might interrogate narratives and collections themselves, their positionality, and indeed that of the museum itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, Florence and Kathleen, for the wonderful presentations. Now there will be a Q&A session, and I invite the audience to type any questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. We already have one question. First of all, there were a couple of previous questions about practical stuff, so I will just say that all the seminars we start at 12:45. This is the correct time, and that the sessions will be recorded and the videos will be published on our website, sloanelab.org. Now, when it comes to questions for the speakers, there is one question by Obisha Bergam that says, awesome presentation. I have a similar project. I'm not into cataloging. There are few people with the experience and expertise within my region. How do I learn cataloging? So I think this is not a trivial question because it touches on inequalities in access to education, also about museum practices. And so I will ask the speakers to say something on this. Maybe Florence, do you want to? Sorry, I think maybe Kathleen, do you want to say something about?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your question. I think I saw the question come up in the chat while Florence was speaking, and I was trying to think of some resources, but I assume from your question that you're not based in the UK and perhaps not based in a museum. Obviously, in my context in museums, there's a lot of resources for cataloguing from the Collections Trust, which is an organisation which basically gives museums standards for how to describe their objects. And also in the UK, there's some resources from the Lottery Heritage Fund about digitisation. And I can post links to those, but I don't know if they will be as relevant to you, so I'm not sure where you're based. But I think that, as I kind of touched on in my presentation, a lot of the guidelines that we have are very much based on that slightly outdated model of centering the museum and centering the management of collections, which is important because you need to know what you have and where. But until recently, there's been much less guidance about how to meaningfully record different perspectives and different things that make things meaningful. And I think that's, you know, that shows in the fact that the Collections Trust only last year updated their cataloguing guidelines to include some of these reflections.
Thank you. Florence, I think you disconnected for a second before. Do you want to answer us this question? Or?
No, to be honest, it disconnected at the perfect point where I'd actually just finished my answer.
Okay. Okay, there was also a second question by the same person. How did your project handle the care principles? So as you know, the care principles for indigenous data governance. I will maybe put for the audience a link in the chat.
Thanks. So I think that was in reference to my cataloguing project. And actually, I'm ashamed to say, although we were thinking about ethics and things while working on the project, I wasn't actually aware of the care principles as a formulation until after I'd finished the project, because it's not something that museums, I don't think, certainly in my experience, have really engaged with. You know, if most people are aware of the FAIR principles, but the care principle was new to me. But having said that, we obviously were thinking about these things the museum was aware that the photographs that had already been digitized were circulating, and they weren't trying to stop them from being posted or shared. Rather, it was just that they wanted to make people aware that there were more photographs. They wanted to be able to make more photographs available, and they wanted to have a link back to the museum, not to assert authority, but so that if people were interested to know more, they knew the source of the photograph and they knew where to come. And I think that something that I've reflected on with the project, which relates to the care principles and the idea of collective benefit, is that I'm aware that probably the people that benefited most was Faiz Mohammed Shi and his family, because it was his relatives in the photographs that he'd recognized. They had that direct connection. And I just think that in the past in museums, I've done a lot of work that benefits a very small group of people, but it's usually a small group of people who are, you know, wealthier white British people who have influence and perhaps are related to a donor, and so they can request to see objects and they'll get special treatment from the museum. So in a way, I quite like the fact that although the benefit was a small group of people, it was a group of people that wouldn't normally receive that kind of special treatment from the museum.
Thank you. Florence, do you also want to say something about the care principles?
No. I mean, in general, I would be really interested in learning more from just how deeply they are embedded within museum practice, and also what differences there might be between the different types of like museums, like national, regional, local. I think that'd be really fascinating to learn more about.
Thank you. Yeah, this is something that we're also looking at in the Sloane Lab, and I think it is very important that we don't just have like the FAIR principles that are about open access mostly, but also that we consider other perspectives. And open science is not truly open if it is just fair, but it is not caring, or let's say. So now we have another question by Paul Ayres about crowdsourcing. It says crowdsourcing cataloging activity to get more perspectives is a great idea. It is our open science based around co-production of answers. How scalable is this approach to museum cataloging? Would AI, artificial intelligence, help? So yeah, this is a very interesting question. Who of you wants to answer? Kathleen, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think that so I wouldn't call, although I was kind of soliciting comments from people and asking people's opinions, I wouldn't call what I was doing crowdsourcing, because it was more targeted. And I think that crowdsourcing generally is kind of aims to be more open to anyone, which ironically means that you often only get a certain type of super user that gets involved in it. I think that with crowdsourcing collection data, you always need a human person to check things. And I think particularly, sorry, I'm getting confused between crowdsourcing and AI. So with crowdsourcing, obviously you need someone who knows the collections to kind of check for errors, but also with AI, you need a human to do this work. I think that collections work is not standardized enough that artificial intelligence can do it. It's always very specific to the contexts and the origins of collections and information. So really, I think it's something that needs skilled and resourced people to do the work, and not AI.
Thank you. And Florence, I believe this also relates to the kind of work that you're doing, where there is a participatory approach and co-production as the as the person who asked the question said, co-production of answers, but involving artificial intelligence in this kind of work, do you think this is something that makes sense? Is it possible? Is it useful?
I mean, straight off, I absolutely am in concurrence, maybe boring, so with Kathleen, and it's because, yeah. So, okay, so speaking from the kind of stuff that I have done, if I am going to transfer any of the output, the creative outputs into, let's say, let's look at it as like a layer of metadata. Yes, actually, there'll be several more layers of refining and making sure. So, for example, you know, if someone, like the way they might respond to an item from a collection or a topic is slightly more abstract, actually there probably is maybe several more maybe sessions or layers of like chatting and workshopping with people just to make sure that, like, you know, we kind of having as much of an understanding as we can about how they are thinking about a particular collection. And then there'll be the issues around, say, sort of like permissions, and also the fact that, well, other people, if we want to make it truly extendable, other people can perhaps almost create their own meta layers based on the metadata that's being outputted from these kind of like creative like sessions. And so actually there's even before we get to, say, something that could automate the connection between like an established like meta layer with, say, the categories within a collection system, like that could be that would definitely be where it would come in. And I know that there's some, I think it's the Museum of London are doing some really interesting work in this space. But actually, even before we could get to that, there'd be a whole set of really fun, but, you know, still several more layers to go of like working with communities and participants and refining and understanding the connections, and maybe even thinking of different ways of connecting, but also keeping truly open so people can see what their labor is a part of and how perhaps it's being shaped and changed with time, because that's one of the that's always a big challenge with anything that kind of gets slooped up by any automation, right? It's like visibility of what has actually gone in, how it's been changed. So yes, I think there's certainly potential, but I think initially there would be a lot of essentially like cleaning as well as generating other meta layers from such data.
Thank you very much. Now there are now 2 more questions in the chat, I see, and another one in the Q&A. So I'm a bit mindful of time, but a question to both Florence and Kathleen from Nina Perlman, who is working on the Sloane Lab. If you would have the power to create a funding stream that museums could apply to in order to create change in the areas you spoke of, what would it be called? What would you call this funding stream? Or how would you describe it? Or, for example, what activities would it prioritize? A very interesting question. It is for both of you. Florence, do you want to?
Gosh, I mean, appropriately, I might sort of crowdsource the name of it and leave it to the public to prioritize. But yeah, no, I mean, if I could have the power to create that funding stream, yeah, I mean, I think, because to be honest, like the big challenge that I come across is that for all that our institutions are owners and custodians, like the irony that I come across is the fact that we actually don't have the, like, really, if we're honest, we don't actually have the capacity to be owners and custodians. So actually, for all that, what I've been talking about is like new metadata and new systems and information architecture. Actually, the thing that would be really needed to support it is hiring more people in, for example, the museum, in our data portal team, or hiring more product, actually just making sure that we have the money to create that layer of people who can actually respond to the needs of our users. Because in some ways that the stuff that I've been discussing it's in comparison, it's actually quite simple, because people love to give their ideas and love to respond to things from museums. That's not the tricky bit. The tricky bit is how do we actually support behind the scenes, support what it is that people really need and really care about,
Thank you. Kathleen, did you also want to answer the question?
Yeah, I don't have a name for it, but I definitely have some ideas about what would be helpful in terms of funding, and that would be to have the capacity to truly, as Florence said, to have more people and to bring together interdisciplinary teams with different skills, because often funders want to fund training, so they'll train people who know how to do museum cataloguing. They might do some training in decolonial practice or anti-racism or whatever. And then you'll have other schemes where they're sort of getting perhaps young people of colour to do training in museum skills. So everyone's doing training and it's not creating more jobs, whereas actually if you paid both of those groups of people to work together on something, that's when you really make change.
Mm-hmm. There is another question by Marco in the chat. Thank you very much for your presentation, Kathleen and Florence. I would like to ask Florence whether you use the methodologies presented to unpack the coloniality of digital systems, or did you use them mostly to look at the museum as an organization as a whole? And if so, what came out of this process?
Yes, no, thank you. Yes, no, that's good. And actually something should have clarified. So the creative methods so far have mostly been used for looking at the museum as and its science as a whole. The stuff that I tend to do to interrogate the coloniality of digital systems, that's more using the sort of the holistic design framework and the narrative-based sort of framework that I earlier mentioned very quickly. And so so certainly from that, now that's mostly been done with people who are either designers of any background or people who are engaging with digital as part of their daily work. And so what tends to come out of that, gratifyingly, is a genuine appreciation for, oh, okay, actually, we might all be saying we want to say be sustainable, or we all want to be ethical, we all want to be user-centered, but actually, if we're all looking at all these different actors in the system, looking at all these different silos, and in some ways, it's not, you've got the departments and individuals might be actors, but you actually, through the process, people come to understand that even the borders are actors in themselves. And so one of the outputs from that is that understanding of those contradictions. It's like, okay, well, it's no wonder we're having this problem, because these couple of actors and these borders, even when they're trying to live up to the same value, actually contradict and almost cancel each other out. So that's one thing that's definitely is what comes out of that process. And so in that sense, it seems to be generally okay at helping people understand that aspect of coloniality. The next problem is actually how you mobilize and organize to tackle that, but that's a whole other set of workshops. And then in terms of like the creative methodologies that I was mentioning to dig into the museum science, yes, so the outputs of those, I mean, yeah, it's obviously because it's very qualitative and it's all kind of on individual basis, but I think overall, definitely what one sees is, as I said, a much more critical engagement with knowledge production, with science, and with, because I said often these are done at lates where, visitors are almost surrounded by, the research that's being done, microscopes on one table, things that they can touch and evaluate. And then they come to this space where actually they start thinking about, well, actually, what does it cost to build that microscope? Where does it come from? And actually, how do you even analyze that data? And how do I represent that data? And oh, it reminds me of this. And then so you get this kind of interesting, I suppose, a new form of, I don't know what one might call it, like epistemic confidence, or something like this sense of like, I am as much a part of knowledge production as the museum is, as a scientist, as a researcher or whatever, as well as I said, a more critical engagement with even the very concept of a museum sometimes.
Thank you very much. I think there are still 3 questions in the Q&A, but it's a bit late. One for Kathleen. Thank you very much for your presentation. I wonder, it's by Amalia. I wonder if all the photos were digitized and put online, or if there was a selection process. And if following your work with the public, there were discussions on copyright, ethics, privacy issues, and if you had any takedown requests. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's a lot of questions in one. So all of them were digitized. Not all of them were put online. That was a kind of a capacity issue. The selection process for those which went online was kind of a bit of a feedback loop with the Instagram followers, as I mentioned earlier. So I was kind of asking questions and looking at which ones got more engagement, what people were interested in. With the display at the Barbican, that was co-curated with Faze and Abira. So Faze chose, I gave him access to all of the photographs that were from the Bajuni Islands, kind of gave sort of high-res copies with no strings attached, and he selected the ones which he wanted to represent. We didn't have any takedown requests, but what I tried to do with each different display output was have a clear line of communication, so that if someone else did recognize someone or had a problem with photos, that they could contact the museum. But we didn't have any issues with that. I hope that's answered everything.
Thank you. So I think since we now have only 3 minutes left, I will hand over to James for a wrap-up. Sorry for the 2 questions that I didn't get to ask. Maybe you can ask directly to the speakers by email or so James, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much, Kathleen and Florence, for two wonderful talks and for answering the questions with such sort of generosity. There were some really wonderful themes that came out of the discussion and your papers, things around vigilant making, communities, and need for specificity, obfuscation and neutrality, past forms of knowing, and of course, probably most importantly, the need for investment of funds into knowledge production and cataloguing, which I think came out really strongly. I'd also like to thank Daniela for co-chairing and the Sloane Lab team, especially Chiara, for keeping things together. And of course, towards the National Collection for funding. The Sloane Lab will be back on the 1st of June, and I can put a link in the chat in a moment, with Kolyad Golob from Linnaeus University and Ina Kisner from Haifa University on topics including controlled vocabularies, queer collections, metadata variability, and explorations of bias. And we hope to see many of you then. And I'll put the link in the chat and then we can all go in good time. But before we do, just an opportunity to thank once again Kathleen and Florence for their wonderful contributions. Thank you.